Welcome to Courageous Conversations. Before we start today, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on what always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I thank the Aboriginal people for their custodianship of the land. I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal people joining us today. Courageous Conversations encourages individuals, organisations and communities to have conversations that challenge sexist comments, discrimination and disrespectful behaviour. Through these discussions and actions, we can create a culture that is free from rigid gender stereotypes and a community where all men and women and boys and girls feel safe, included and respected. During this program, we encourage you to consider what gender equity and respect means to you and to your community. This is Session 2, Part 1, Where Does Violence Against Women Start?
Hello and welcome to Courageous Conversations Session 2. My name is Michael Maxwell from Blacktown City Council and I work in the Community Development Unit. With me today is...
I'm Jessica Varela. I'm the Safer Communities Coordinator in the Social Planning team at Blacktown City Council.
This session we're going to look at where does violence against women start. In the last session you looked at a lot of stats and facts and figures. We're now going to take those and have a look at where they fit into the grand scheme of things in the process of violence against women.
This is a two-part session. We're going to be starting off now with part 1.
We're looking at courageous conversations because in our society, especially in Blacktown where we work, there's over 8,000 police call-outs a year to our 3 police area commands in relation to domestic violence. And that results in about 2,000 actual recorded incidents of domestic violence. Most of those, by far the bulk of those, are violence against women. Courageous Conversations is a way of tapping into and understanding that process. It picks up on the fact that spirits are broken and families are destroyed and people's lives are actually taken in the most horrific ways in situations of domestic violence. Courageous Conversations actually gives us the ability to change that story and to connect with others and talk to them about the things that are important to them.
Now, if at any stage during this session you feel that you need to take a break, we ask that you please do so. Thank you. So, Michael, we were talking about, you started talking about the statistics, particularly locally in Blacktown, about violence against women. So now we're going to start looking at some of those statistics, and I'd like to start off with an interesting statistic that we've got related to domestic violence, and it says that domestic violence is a greater health risk factor to women aged 25 to 44, far greater than smoking, alcohol, and injury from physical activity.
Well, it's interesting that when you think about those 3 things, smoking, alcohol and sports injuries and physical injuries, there are actually widely promoted and advertised programs around each of those to reduce those. The enormous amounts of money have been spent on anti-smoking and anti-drinking campaigns. When you compare that to messaging and campaigns around reducing violence against women, it just doesn't stack up. It's almost like here is a secret thing that we don't talk about, violence against women, where we're happy to talk about the others and talk about great victories. What happens if we ran a quit campaign against violence against women and not just smoking and use that same language? Would that have the same impact? That's they're questions that need to be asked and answered. Certainly Courageous Conversations is part of that answer. And Courageous Conversations enables us to change the story and talk to people and talk to ourselves.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that key about this this program is that it allows us to have those conversations that sometimes can be challenging to have with other people, but also with ourselves. Having the courage to be able to process, to perhaps some of the things that have happened in your individual experience, where you may have felt that you weren't good enough, or you may have been told that you weren't good enough, or that you weren't worthy enough. And we know that violence against women is highly correlated, or I suppose the core there is about that gender inequality.
Yes, and we'll come back to that. But there was just something you mentioned there about the violence against women. Just struck me that the stat on the screen there, that one woman every week in Australia is a domestic violence homicide casualty. So one woman every week is murdered by an intimate partner somewhere in Australia. The really scary thing is that these stats have been consistent for about the last 8 years and aren't changing. And that is really horrific. 1/4 of those homicide cases are committed by a current or former partner, which we will come back to in a later session and talk about. The greatest risk to women leaving domestic violence is at that point of departure from the former partner. Very scary situation.
On average, 8 women a day are hospitalised after being a victim of violence perpetrated by their spouse or partner. And we know that 1 in 12 of those women are pregnant at the time.
And this goes back to the stats that we looked at last session, which talked about the number of victims of domestic violence who are women, which is why we keep talking about violence against women. The vast majority of victims of violence in the home are female, which is a horrific situation. Yes, there's violence against men. Yes, there's violence against elders. Yes, there's violence against youth, between youth and parents and youth. And yes, there are a horrific number of infant mortalities that result from domestic violence. But the largest category of people who are the victims of domestic violence are women. So other organisations and programs will address those other groups. We're just going to focus in on the violence against women in Courageous Conversations because of statistics like you've just talked about.
And we also know that violence against women isn't just about the hospitalisations, the impact on health, but it also affects homelessness. 72,000 women, 34,000 children, 9,000 men have sought help for homelessness due to family violence. So we've got to think it's a bigger picture.
And they're horrific numbers. We will go back to, I'll go back to my point about youth before, because what we're talking about here is women and children effectively fleeing the home. What we don't see, and what's hidden in these statistics sometimes, are the teenage girls who have been forced to flee home at some level, who find themselves either couch surfing, staying with friends, or staying nowhere, who are additional figures to those. So in any discussion of homelessness, especially homelessness as a result of violence against women, you've got these hidden numbers. So what we do see in the numbers always underreport what the situation actually is. And while those people are leaving home and trying to find somewhere else to go, the reality is that women who are about to or who have recently ended a relationship are at greatest risk of experiencing violence. Where they flee to is significantly important. So females looking for accommodation who are at risk of homelessness are also at added risk of being found and suffering violence from their partner. And that fear is understandable, because a woman who has fled, and I use the word deliberately, fled domestic violence, fled the violence that's being perpetrated on her, will have done so because she's fearful in that situation. But she will have left behind someone who'll be blaming her, who'll be feeling angry, who'll be feeling rejected, and who will be seeking in some way to express that. She will have left fearful of what she's left behind, fearful of what might happen to her in the process, and totally unknowing what the future holds for her. So very, very vulnerable situation to be in. And 54% of women who've experienced current partner violence experience it more than once. So these ladies will be fleeing knowing that the situation they've left might not be the end of the story.
And let's take a look at the groups of women who are particularly at greater risk, because I also find this data quite interesting. Indigenous women, young women, pregnant women, women who are separating from their partners, as you mentioned before, women with a disability, women with financial hardship. So essentially what we're seeing is potentially groups of women who are already quite vulnerable. And this is adding.
Absolutely. And then we get the intersections of those situations. So there's no reason why there may not be a young Indigenous pregnant woman separating from her partner. And any of those categories will probably mean that she's already experiencing financial hardship. So one of those factors alone will lead to significant fear and disadvantage. Once you start layering those intersections up, you start to increase the risk and the disadvantage that goes with it. Good point, Jess.
So it's quite, I suppose, what the data is telling us is this is quite a complex problem, and really, really difficult stats, I suppose, to look at. How did we get here? How did it get so challenging?
And when you think about that, there's a whole host of reasons why that's the case. It's not an Australian thing. It's not a Western thing. It's a global thing. It's not a new thing. For millennia, the world has lived with these highly patriarchal frameworks in which they've operated. There's been culture after culture after culture giving the same sort of messages that sort of privilege males against females. There's that whole argument about, are our thoughts, are our social understandings and socializations inherent in us? Is it part of our nature, or are they taught to us? The argument is really quite irrelevant. One way or another, we get them, and they're brought forward all the time. Right down to the fact that, young babies, I still see boys dressed in blue and girls dressed in pink.
So it really takes us to the topic of stereotyping. I suppose, this might be an opportunity to think about what some of those common stereotypes exist in our societies, and also in our cultural belief system. Australia is quite a multicultural country. So we have these gender stereotypes that kind of sit across, all of society, but then there's also those gender stereotypes that sit within certain cultural groups.
They've changed a bit over the last few years, but there's a number of TV shows that really perpetuate this. I have the privilege of living in a house with young children. We watch Bob the Builder, Postman Pat, Fireman Sam,
Dora the Explorer.
Watch this video and see what you think.
This afternoon, we're going to draw people doing different jobs. And the first job we're going to draw is a firefighter.
Have a think in your head what a firefighter looks to you.
What's your firefighter called?
Mine's called Firefighter Gary.
Firefighter Stack. Firefighter Simon.
He's big and strong.
He's got a big helmet on.
That's brilliant, isn't it?
Next, we're going to draw a surgeon.
Have you thought of a name for your surgeon?
Jim Bob.
Jim Bob.
He's a brain surgeon.
I think he would wear a stethoscope. He gives you medicine.
That's his ambulance.
OK, next, we're going to draw a fighter pilot.
This is his jet plane.
He rescues people.
He likes to do stunts in the air and stuff.
OK, now who would like to meet these people for real?
They're dressed up.
My name's Tamsin and I'm a surgeon in the NHS.
My name's Lauren and I'm a pilot in the Royal Air Force.
My name's Lucy. I'm a firefighter in the London Fire Brigade.
So who wants to know how to do an operation?
Who's putting it on?
I'm trying my stethoscope.
We put this in here. There you go. Now you're a proper fighter pilot.
So into your ears. Can you hear that?
Yeah.
It's really good. It's much better, it's much better than the kids' one.
Got him.
So what a great, powerful video that was to watch. I think, one of my favourite parts is when they do a close-up on the little girl's face and her face just lights up when she sees that, firefighter, surgeon, I think, army, military officer are all women. And even the little boy's face where he was like, oh, I'm confused. What does that mean? But really great video that just I think highlights how important it is that the information that we're giving, or that we're aware of what we're telling children, with the TV shows that you just spoke about, with the story of who plays what role, and in the space of courageous conversations, it's really important because that's where those, age 5 to 7, that's where those gender stereotypes start settling in for children. I think it's also important to acknowledge, looking at those little boys and what we're telling little boys about what role they need to be playing in society. I think on, my personal story, my family, I have the most incredible nephew. He's a dancer, an incredible dancer, and it's inspired a lot of girls to dance. But there's also those roles that we say, these are the roles that men play, these are the roles that women play, and when that changes, it starts to open up the space for us to contemplate equality, which is, I think, where we need to go to.
It does, and it sort of poses questions or makes into questions something that should never need to be questioned. Like, why, for example, is it inappropriate for a girl to aspire to be a surgeon, a police officer, an army person, fly a plane?
Yeah.
I wouldn't fly a plane, so they can have it. But it's just this, and it's not just the roles, but as you pointed out, the characteristics that then go with that. So over time, we have lines like boys will be boys, and I remember being told not to run like a girl. I'm not sure how girls run, but if I might do it still, I don't know, because it was never explained to me. I grew up, and probably a sign of my age, but I grew up watching movies and things about cowboys and Indians, and even the Thunderbirds TV show, where everything was a male. And on Thunderbirds, Lady Penelope keeps getting told that she's just a beautiful woman. Or she had beautiful teapots, and things as well. Dream of Jeannie and those sort of shows all showed this woman to be the domestic person, and it was the male who was the breadwinner. And there was no logical reason why that should be the case. And fortunately, I think society's moved on, but not at the deep level, where those stereotypes still carry on.
Yeah, and I think that now in contemporary times, we are starting to see a lot more TV shows that are showing women performing roles that traditionally would have been a show about a man playing that role. House Husbands is one of the TV shows that I loved watching, Australian TV show that I loved watching because it showed men raising children, and it was a great TV show. So that we can start challenging these old beliefs that we have. Michael, I think now let's look at some of those stereotypes that we've kind of grown up hearing about boys and girls, and some of the characteristics that are associated with boys and girls.
And on the screen is a whole bunch of lists that are just so typical. Boys are going to be strong, and they'll be the provider. Big boys don't cry. I think little boys are allowed to, but big boys aren't supposed to cry. I don't know that any male has ever been accused of being level-headed, but I'll just leave that as a sexist comment. But we're supposed to be competent and logical and analytical and assertive. We're supposed to be the strong people who are to be feared when they come home. So, be used as the threat. Wait till your father gets home.
Yeah.
Whereas women are portrayed as loving and caring and soft and warm and fuzzy. I might have had a very confused upbringing because my parents were both newsagents. In a small news agency, they worked 6.5 days a week. In those days, they worked every day that the paper was printed, which was every day except Good Friday and Christmas Day. Our house, basically, if something needed to happen and you were there, you did it. So everything was quite equal. So I had this confused upbringing where everyone was sort of equal all the way through. But I know, but looking at my friends growing up, that was very much not the case.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, I can completely relate to that. I grew up with an older brother and a whole lot of older male cousins, and it was kind of like toughen up, princess, or you know, you're going to have a hard time. But then there was also those expectations of how a girl needs to behave. And I think what's interesting also about this list is that when boys don't portray this, it's seen as a sign of weakness. You know, it's if you did cry, or if you were overly emotional or overly compassionate, caring, you know, even if you liked playing with dolls, that's a sign of weakness. And that's I think also where that shame starts to set in. That then later, you know, that emerges into these issues around power dynamics in a household.
And if you flip it around and girls start acting with the boys' characteristics, they get shut down very quickly and told not to do it.
Yeah, so, and we have those there, you know, temperamental, you know, tomboy, or a whole lot of labels, and it's that shaming, you know, that shaming of if you act this way, you are not being feminine enough, and that's a bad thing. And then that plays out later on in life.
Now, why are we talking about this? It's because this stereotyping and the unwritten expectations that go with it are one of the strongest forms of dominance, if you like, or persecution against females that we see in our society. Males as well, but if we're talking here about violence against women, a lot of these expectations are unwritten but set in stone. And if a female doesn't conform to them in the eyes of a partner, then conflict occurs and violence can easily result because of it. So it's stereotyping is not simply inappropriate or bad news. It's actually quite risky. And if we can lead down the track to changing those expectations, we can start to have those courageous conversations about what a woman's role really is, not only in her home, but in society, or not only in society, but in her home.
Yeah. And start also, you know, thinking about how you start changing that in your interactions with people going forward.
So we're going to leave you with that to reflect on. We'll be back in part 2 to talk more about gender equality and gender equity and how those relate to violence against women.